Every morning, somewhere on Earth, someone takes the very first sip of coffee. A surgeon finishing a night shift, a truck driver preparing for a 1,000-mile journey, a university student desperately trying to stay awake before an exam, a writer staring at a blank page, a father quietly enjoying 10 peaceful minutes before the rest of the family wakes up. Different people, different lives, the same ritual. It happens so often that we almost never stop to ask a simple question. Why coffee? Not tea, not wine, not beer. Why did this dark, bitter drink become the fuel of the modern world? The answer seems obvious. Because coffee keeps us awake. Or at least, that's what most people believe. But if that were true, kings would never have tried to ban it. Religious leaders would never have declared it sinful. Governments would never have closed coffeehouses. History rarely fears a drink. History fears what happens when people gather around one. That is the real story of coffee. Not the story of caffeine. Not the story of a bean. But the story of conversations. Because long before social media, before newspapers, before radio, before television, there was a place where strangers met every day to exchange ideas. Some ideas changed businesses. Others changed science. A few changed the world. And almost all of them began with the same simple invitation. Would you like a cup of coffee? Yet none of this was supposed to happen. The coffee tree did not evolve to inspire revolutions. It didn't grow to build empires or reshape economies. It simply grew in silence, hidden among the mist-covered forests of East Africa for thousands of years. Unknown to kings, unknown to merchants, unknown to the rest of the world. Until one day someone noticed that a few goats refused to sleep. Whether that story is entirely true, no one can say. But sometimes, a legend survives because it captures something the history alone cannot. And if we follow that legend back to where it began, we don't just discover the origin of coffee. We discover something far more extraordinary. The story of how one forgotten History plant has an uncomfortable quietly changed relationship the with course of legends. human civilization. Historians spend their lives separating fact from fiction. But sometimes, a legend survives for centuries because it reveals a truth that facts alone never could. The story of coffee begins with one of those legends. It takes us to the Ethiopian Highlands nearly 1,000 years ago. A land of towering mountains, ancient forests, morning mist, drifting silently through valleys untouched by roads or cities. Long before coffee became a global commodity, before cafés filled the streets of Paris, before merchants carried sacks of beans across oceans, coffee was simply another wild plant hidden among countless others. Almost invisible, almost forgotten. According to tradition, a young goat herder named Kaldi noticed something strange one afternoon. His goats refused to sleep. Instead of settling down as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, they became strangely energetic, running, jumping, almost dancing across the rocky hillsides. At first, Kaldi thought something was wrong. Perhaps the animals had eaten a poisonous plant. Perhaps they were frightened by a predator hidden somewhere in the forest. Curious, he followed them. One by one, the goats wandered toward a shrub covered with small crimson berries. They eagerly chewed the fruit. Minutes later, they were still restless, still awake, still full of energy. Kaldi picked a handful of the berries himself. They looked ordinary. Nothing about them suggested they would one day become one of the world's most valuable agricultural products. According to the legend, he carried the mysterious fruit to a nearby monastery. The monks were suspicious. Some believed the berries were a temptation sent to distract the faithful. One monk supposedly threw them into the fire. Then something unexpected happened. As the berries roasted, they released an aroma unlike anything anyone had experienced before. Rich, warm, sweet. The smell filled the monastery. Curiosity replaced fear. The roasted beans were removed from the fire, crushed into small pieces, mixed with hot water. And history remembers that moment as the birth of coffee. It is a wonderful story. There is only one problem. It almost certainly never happened. No contemporary records mention Kaldi. No Ethiopian manuscript from the 9th century tells his story. In fact, the legend does not appear in written history until hundreds of years later. That doesn't make the legend worthless. Quite the opposite. Legends often survive because they preserve something deeper than literal truth. And in this case, the legend points us towards something historians do agree on. Coffee was born here, not inside a royal palace, not in a laboratory, not in the kitchen of a famous inventor. It was born in the wild. The forests of southwestern Ethiopia remain the natural home of Coffea arabica even today. Hidden beneath towering trees, wild coffee plants have been growing there for thousands of years, long before anyone realized their value. For the local Oromo people, coffee wasn't originally a drink at all. The bright red cherries were crushed and mixed with animal fat to create small balls of concentrated energy. Hunters carried them during long journeys through the mountains. Travelers relied on them when food became scarce. Others simply chewed the fruit while working. Coffee wasn't a luxury. It wasn't a ritual. It wasn't even called coffee. It was simply another way to survive. Ironically, the chemical that would eventually keep millions of people awake every morning was never created for humans. Caffeine evolved as the coffee plant's own defense. It poisoned insects. It slowed the growth of competing plants. It was nature's weapon. Humanity simply discovered another use for it. For centuries, the world beyond Ethiopia knew nothing about these mysterious berries. Empires rose and fell. Trade routes crossed continents. Great cities flourished, and still, coffee remained hidden in the mountains, waiting, not for a king, not for an explorer, but for a journey across one of the narrowest stretches of water on Earth. A journey of less than 200 miles. One that would quietly reshape the future of civilization. Across the Red Sea. By the time coffee was just beginning, nothing about it suggested that history was about to change. It wasn't rare enough to be called treasure. It wasn't beautiful enough to become a symbol of royalty. It wasn't powerful enough to win a war. At least, not yet. Across the narrow waters separating Africa from the Arabian Peninsula lay Yemen. A harsh land of dry mountains, scattered villages, and ancient trade routes that connected Africa, Arabia, Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean. For centuries, merchants carried gold, silk, spices, incense, and precious stones across these routes. Coffee wasn't one of them, not in the beginning. When the first coffee plants arrived in Yemen, nobody planted them with dreams of building an empire. Nobody imagined global trade. Nobody saw fortune hidden inside those small green seeds. Instead, coffee found its first true home in an unexpected place: monasteries. As night fell across the mountains of Yemen, the world became almost completely silent, except for one place. Inside small stone monasteries, groups of Sufi mystics gathered for hours of prayer. Their goal wasn't simply to worship. It was to reach a spiritual state they believed could only be achieved through long nights of meditation, chanting own remembrance of God. Hour after hour, their voices echoed through candlelit halls. But they faced the same enemy every human has always faced: exhaustion. No matter how devoted the spirit, the body eventually demanded sleep. According to early Islamic traditions, Sufi monks discovered that a dark drink made from roasted coffee beans helped them remain awake through the night, not because they wanted more energy for work, not because they enjoyed its taste, but because every extra hour awake became another hour of prayer. For them, coffee wasn't a luxury. It wasn't entertainment. It was discipline. It was devotion served in a simple clay cup. Night after night, the drink quietly spread from one monastery to another. Travelers noticed, merchants became curious, pilgrims carried stories home, and little by little, coffee began leaving the mountains. Not through conquest, not through royal decree, but through conversation, one cup at a time. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. The plant had evolved to keep insects away, yet it was now bringing people together. The monks believed they had discovered a gift that strengthened faith. Merchants saw something completely different: opportunity. Because every traveler returning from Yemen asked the same question: what is that drink everyone stays awake for? It wouldn't be long before demand grew faster than supply. And for the first time in history, coffee stopped being a sacred drink. It became a business. The bean had finally entered the marketplace, and once money entered the story, everything changed. History is full of inventions that changed the world. The wheel changed transportation, paper changed knowledge, gunpowder changed warfare. But sometimes, the greatest invention isn't an object at all. Sometimes, it's simply a room. By the early 15th century, coffee was no longer confined to quiet monasteries hidden in the mountains of Yemen. It had reached the busy streets of Mecca. The city was unlike any other. Every year, thousands of pilgrims arrived from across the Islamic world. They brought languages, traditions, ideas, and news from places most people would never see. For merchants, Mecca was a marketplace. For believers, it was the heart of their faith. For coffee, it became the beginning of something entirely new. At first, coffee was still sold as a drink. People bought a cup, finished it, and left. But slowly, something unexpected began to happen. People didn't leave, they stayed. One conversation became another. A traveler described a distant kingdom beyond the desert. A merchant shared rumors about rising prices in Cairo. A scholar challenged an old interpretation of philosophy. A poet recited verses to complete strangers. Hour after hour, the room remained full. Nobody had planned this. Nobody designed coffee houses to become centers of knowledge. They simply became places where people wanted to remain. Perhaps for the first time in history, ordinary people had discovered a space that belonged to conversation itself. Not a mosque, not a palace, not a marketplace, a different kind of public space, one where status mattered less than ideas. Soon, these coffee houses spread beyond Mecca. They appeared in Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and eventually, Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans gave these places a name: cafés, coffee houses. Inside, life unfolded at an entirely different rhythm. Chessboards covered wooden tables. Storytellers captivated crowds with tales of heroes in distant lands. Musicians filled the air with melodies that echoed through smoke and candlelight. Merchants negotiated business deals. Judges debated the law. Students questioned their teachers. Strangers became friends over a shared cup. For a single coin, anyone could enter. It did not matter whether you were wealthy or poor, educated or illiterate, powerful or unknown. Everyone listened. Everyone spoke. Everyone learned. Some historians would later describe coffeehouses as the world's first social networks, centuries before newspapers reached every home, before telegraphs carried messages across continents, before the internet connected billions of people. Information traveled from person to person, table to table, cup to cup. Ideas moved faster than armies ever could, and that frightened those in power. Because kings can control roads, they can tax merchants, they can command soldiers, but controlling a conversation is something else entirely. The more coffeehouses appeared, the harder they became to silence. Soon, rumors spread that dangerous ideas were being discussed behind their doors. Criticism of rulers, questions about religion, arguments over justice. Whether every accusation was true hardly mattered. Power has always feared places where people think freely. In 1511, the governor of Mecca attempted to ban coffee altogether. Officially, he claimed it encouraged immoral behavior. Unofficially, many believed he feared the conversations that surrounded it far more than the drink itself. The ban did not last. Coffee returned, the conversations returned, and the coffeehouses became even more popular than before. History had quietly discovered something extraordinary. Coffee had never been the real revolution. Conversation was. The drink simply gave that revolution a place to begin. Imagine beginning every morning with a mug of beer. Not because you were celebrating, not because you were an alcoholic, but because it was safer than water. For centuries, that was everyday life across much of Europe. Rivers flowing through crowded cities were often polluted. Wells were easily contaminated. Fresh drinking water could be dangerously unreliable, so people brewed what historians now call small beer, a weak, low-alcohol drink consumed by almost everyone, including children. It didn't make people drunk, but it also didn't make them particularly alert. Then, something new arrived from the east. It was black, bitter, unlike anything Europeans had ever tasted. The first reaction was not excitement, it was suspicion. Some called it the drink of the devil. Others claimed no Christian should consume a beverage invented in the Islamic world. The controversy became so intense that the debate eventually reached Rome. According to tradition, critics urged Pope Clement VIII to ban coffee before it spread any further. They expected the Pope to condemn it. Instead, he asked for a cup. After tasting it, the story goes, he smiled and declared that it would be a shame to leave such a delicious drink to non-believers alone. Whether every detail of that story is true remains uncertain, but one thing is beyond doubt. Coffee stayed, and once it did, Europe began to change in ways almost nobody could have predicted. Coffeehouses appeared first in Venice, then Oxford, London, Paris, Vienna, one city after another, one cup after another. But unlike taverns, where alcohol often ended conversations, coffeehouses seemed to sharpen them. People stayed awake longer, thought more clearly, argued more passionately. Ideas collided, disagreements became discoveries. Inside London's coffeehouses, merchants discussed trade routes stretching across the globe. Scientists demonstrated strange new inventions. Doctors debated anatomy. Philosophers questioned centuries of accepted wisdom. Writers searched for better words. Investors searched for better futures. One visitor observed that entering a coffee house was like walking into an entire university, except the tuition cost only a single cup of coffee. Soon, these cafés earned an extraordinary nickname: the penny universities. For the price of 1 penny, almost anyone could sit beside scholars, merchants, explorers, inventors, and political thinkers. Knowledge was no longer trapped inside castles or monasteries. It had moved into public conversation. Some of history's most influential institutions quietly began inside coffee houses. Lloyd's of London, which would grow into one of the world's largest insurance markets, started as conversations inside Edward Lloyd's Coffee House. The London Stock Exchange traces part of its origins to traders gathering in cafés. Newspapers found their earliest audiences there. Scientific societies recruited members there. Business partnerships were formed there. Revolutions were whispered there. Looking back, it's tempting to believe coffee changed Europe because caffeine made people work harder. But that wasn't its greatest gift. Coffee changed Europe because it changed what people did with their mornings. For the first time in history, millions of people began the day not with alcohol, but with clarity. The modern workday, the scientific revolution, the explosion of commerce. None of these movements were created by coffee alone, but coffee quietly became the drink they all shared. Without intending to, one small bean had become the unofficial fuel of the Enlightenment, and while Europe embraced coffee as the drink of progress, another chapter of the story was already unfolding, one far darker than anything that had come before. Because Europe's growing appetite for coffee demanded something it had never needed before: an endless supply of beans. And somewhere across the Atlantic, millions of lives were about to be changed forever. Had fallen in love with coffee. The demand seemed endless. Every morning, more cafés opened. More merchants placed orders. More ships crossed the oceans carrying precious sacks of beans. Coffee had become more than a drink. It had become a global business. But there was one problem. Coffee trees are patient. Empires are not. A coffee tree takes years before producing its first meaningful harvest. It grows best in very specific climates: high elevations, rich volcanic soil, gentle rainfall, warm days, cool nights. You couldn't simply plant coffee anywhere, and Europe had almost no suitable land. If Europeans wanted more coffee, they would have to grow it somewhere else, somewhere they controlled. That realization transformed coffee from a cultural phenomenon into a colonial obsession. Across the Atlantic, European empires searched for new lands capable of producing the crop that millions had come to depend upon. The Dutch carried coffee seedlings to Java. The French smuggled young plants across the ocean to the Caribbean. The Portuguese expanded vast plantations across Brazil. Each empire raced to grow more than the others. But planting coffee was the easy part. Harvesting it was another story entirely. Unlike wheat or rice, coffee cherries cannot all be picked at once. Each branch ripens at a different pace. The brightest red cherries must be selected by hand, one by one, tree after tree, season after season. It demanded an enormous workforce, and that workforce came at an unimaginable human cost. Across plantations in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, millions of enslaved Africans were forced into brutal labor. From sunrise until darkness covered the fields, they planted, pruned, harvested, carried, sorted, again and again. The world celebrated coffee as the drink of conversation and enlightenment. Yet the hands that produced it rarely experienced either. History is often filled with uncomfortable contradictions. The same drink that inspired philosophers to debate freedom was helping sustain an economic system built upon slavery. The same cafés where people discussed human rights served coffee harvested by people who possessed none. It is one of history's cruelest ironies. By the 19th century, Brazil had become the world's largest coffee producer. Its plantations stretched beyond the horizon. Entire railways were built to transport coffee from inland farms to coastal ports. Cities expanded because of coffee. Banks financed coffee. Governments depended on coffee taxes. The bean that once grew unnoticed in Ethiopian forests had become one of the engines of the global economy. Even after slavery was abolished in many countries, exploitation did not disappear. It simply changed its form. Poor farmers replaced enslaved workers. Debt replaced chains. Economic dependence replaced legal ownership. The faces changed. The struggle often remained. Today, millions of families still depend on coffee for their livelihoods. Many produce some of the finest coffee in the world, yet they receive only a tiny fraction of the price paid by consumers thousands of miles away. A cup purchased in New York, London, Tokyo, or Paris contains a history that stretches across continents, a history of exploration, trade, empire, innovation, and sacrifice. Coffee had connected the world, but not equally. Its journey had created extraordinary wealth for some and extraordinary hardship for others. Yet despite everything, humanity's relationship with coffee was only becoming stronger, because by the 20th century, coffee was no longer simply changing economies. It was beginning to change time itself. Every civilization has searched for a way to do one impossible thing: to create more time, not by changing the clock, but by changing the human body. For thousands of years, the rhythm of life was dictated by the sun. People woke with the sunrise, worked until daylight disappeared, and rested because there was little else they could do. Even after the invention of candles and oil lamps, the body still had the final say. Eventually, everyone became tired. Then the Industrial Revolution arrived. Factories didn't sleep. Machines didn't wait for sunrise. Production continued hour after hour, day after day. For the first time in history, millions of people were expected to work according to the rhythm of machines. Instead of the rhythm of nature, the modern world demanded something humans had never been asked to provide before: longer attention, greater focus, higher productivity. Coffee was perfectly suited for that new world. Morning coffee became part of the working day. Factory workers drank it before long shifts. Engineers relied on it while designing bridges and railways. Doctors reached for another cup during exhausting nights in crowded hospitals. Writers filled their mugs before facing another blank page. Scientists carried coffee into laboratories. Journalists into newsrooms. Teachers into classrooms. Soldiers into command centers. Without anyone planning it, coffee quietly became the companion of modern work. It wasn't simply helping people stay awake. It was helping societies stay productive. By the 20th century, coffee had become one of the world's most valuable traded commodities. Only oil was often considered more important in international trade. Entire economies depended upon the harvest. Millions of families depended upon the crop. Every interruption to coffee production echoed through global markets. Wars affected coffee. Economic crises affected coffee. Climate affected coffee. Coffee was no longer just agriculture. It had become infrastructure. Then came another transformation. In 1938, a Swiss company searching for a way to preserve surplus coffee developed a product that would change everyday life once again. Instant coffee. No roasting, no grinding, no waiting, just hot water. For soldiers during the Second World War, it became a small comfort carried across continents. For office workers, it saved precious minutes. For travelers, it brought familiarity to unfamiliar places. Convenience had entered the story, and coffee adapted once again. Decades later, another generation found a different relationship with the drink. Programmers writing code through the night, entrepreneurs chasing impossible ideas, medical residents working 30-hour shifts, artists searching for inspiration long after midnight. Coffee remained the same. Human ambition did not. Today, more than 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed around the world every single day. Not because everyone loves the taste, but because every cup represents something slightly different. For one person, it's energy. For another, it's comfort. For someone else, it's routine, or friendship, or solitude, or simply a quiet moment before the world becomes loud again. Perhaps that is coffee's greatest achievement. It became more than a beverage. It became a ritual shared by humanity itself. And yet, after everything coffee has given us, one question still remains. Did coffee truly change the world? Or did it simply reveal something that had always existed inside us? Tomorrow morning, before the world fully wakes up, millions of people will repeat a ritual so familiar that they barely notice it. Water will begin to boil. Coffee beans will be ground. The aroma will quietly fill another kitchen, another office, another cafe. Someone will take the first sip and immediately begin thinking about everything waiting for them that day. Most will never wonder how that cup arrived in their hands. They will not think about the forests of Ethiopia or the mountains of Yemen. They will not remember the Sufi monks who stayed awake through long nights of prayer, or the crowded coffee houses where strangers debated ideas that would reshape nations. They will never see the ships crossing oceans, or the plantations that transformed distant landscapes, or the generations of workers whose lives became tied to a single crop. Yet every cup carries all of those stories, invisible, silent, waiting to be remembered. Coffee never became powerful because of its flavor, nor because of the caffeine hidden inside each bean. Its greatest power came from something much simpler. It gave people a reason to pause, to sit together, to ask questions, to disagree, to imagine. Again and again throughout history, the most important conversations rarely began with certainty. They began with curiosity, and very often, with a cup of coffee resting quietly between two people. Perhaps that is why coffee survived every attempt to ban it. It survived changing religions, changing empires, changing economies, changing technologies, because coffee was never competing with tea or wine or any other drink. It was answering something far older, a deeply human desire, the desire to gather, to learn, to create, to belong. Today, our conversations travel through screens instead of crowded coffee houses. Ideas circle the world in seconds instead of months. The places have changed. The technology has changed, but the instinct remains exactly the same. We still gather. We still exchange ideas. We still search for connection. In many ways, the world built new coffee houses. They simply look different now. Perhaps history did not change because people drank coffee, Perhaps coffee simply revealed the kind of civilization humanity had been trying to build all along. A civilization connected not only by roads, or ships, or trade, but by conversation. So tomorrow morning, when you lift your cup for the first sip, pause for just a moment. Inside that quiet ritual lives the story of wandering shepherds, midnight prayers, fearful kings, restless philosophers, ocean crossings, forgotten workers, and billions of ordinary mornings just like your own. Because sometimes the greatest forces in history do not arrive with the sound of armies. They arrive quietly, one conversation, one idea, one cup at a time.